This video is brought to you by Skillshare. What's up, folks? How's it going? This is Waj. Hope you guys are all doing well. And what you're looking at is the 2020 Apple iPad Pro. Now, what we're going to do is take a look at this new generation iPad Pro and see how it compares against not only the previous generation, but see how it fares up against its nearest rivals from the Microsoft side, the Surface Pro X and the Surface Pro 7. Now, compared to the previous generation iPad Pro that got launched back in 2018, which in my opinion was a real game changer in the whole premium tablet division due to the fact that it was extremely powerful in terms of its internal processing capability with the A12X processor, a sleek minimalistic design with thin bezels, rounded corners, and the new 2020 version of the iPad Pro shares that exact same design language. Now, in terms of the improvements of the new generation, there are only two notable things to talk about. One is the addition of a secondary camera on the rear-facing side. We have a wide camera now, as well as a new LiDAR depth sensor on the back. Secondly, we also have a minor upgrade in the internal capabilities with the Apple A12Z Bionic processor. It's essentially identical in terms of the capabilities of the previous generation 8-core A12X processor, but with 8 GPU cores instead of 7 from the previous generation. Most likely, Apple just took an A12X and enabled a 8th GPU core that was already there to begin with to create this new generation A12Z processor. Now, we're going to go into the performance results of the new generation iPad Pro, but let's first talk about how the iPad Pro compares against the Surface Pro X and Surface Pro 7 from Microsoft. Firstly, in terms of design, it's still way thinner than both the Surface Pro X and Surface Pro 7, only measuring around 5.9 millimeters in terms of thickness. Now, even though the Surface Pro X is the latest version of the Surface Pro lineup of tablets from Microsoft, and it is thinner in terms of profiles and bezels compared to the Surface Pro 7, which looks identical to the Surface Pro lineup of tablets that's been out for the last 4 or 5 generations, but it's still slightly heavier and thicker than the iPad Pro in the current iteration. And in terms of the overall portability sake of things, all of these tablets are essentially the same overall footprint, so there's no real difference there. But in terms of factoring, probably the most important facet about tablets at this category, which is going to be the displays. Now, the 2020 iPad Pro has the same liquid retina display that we found in the previous generation. We have a pixel density count of about 265. We still have an extremely bright overall display rated up to 600 nits. And compared to the Surface Pro X and Surface Pro 7, which have a 3:2 aspect ratio display, the Microsoft tablets actually have a slightly higher pixel density count, about 267 ppi. The really key thing that I think is probably most important on the iPad Pro is the fact that they have 120 hertz refresh rate, which is double the 60 hertz refresh rate that the Microsoft tablets are stuck with. Furthermore, in terms of speakers and microphone configuration, we have a triple mic array on the iPad Pro, as well as quad speakers on all 4 corners of the tablet on the Apple side, versus we have dual speaker configuration on the Microsoft tablets with dual microphone configuration as well. The sound is definitely better on the iPad Pro based on my experience. If you're watching movies, listening to music, it's definitely the better experience. But one advantage that the Surface Pro 7 especially has is connectivity. It has one full-size USB Type-A 3.0 connection, a headphone jack, USB-C connection, as well as a microSD expansion slot. The Surface Pro X comparatively is a lot more limited, basically only 2 USB-C connections, and the iPad Pro is the most limited with only 1 connection, which is a single USB-C connection. So in terms of expansion and connectivity options, the Surface Pro 7 is definitely the best in terms of that, which is important if you're going to be using these things as laptop replacement tablets versus the Surface Pro X and iPad Pro. You're going to have to deal with a lot of messy, inconvenient adapters. Furthermore, in terms of wireless technology, both the iPad Pro and the Surface Pro X have Wi-Fi and LTE connectivity options. The Surface Pro 7 only has Wi-Fi for the time being in terms of internet connectivity. Now, one other minor upgrade on the new 2020 iPad is that it utilizes 802.11ax or Wi-Fi 6 alliance. So if you have a new router that is certified with AX Wi-Fi or Wi-Fi 6, you can utilize those faster, higher bandwidth speeds speeds available to you versus the other tablets are using the more conventional AC and lower protocol standards. Now, before we go on any further, I just want to briefly talk about Skillshare that made this video possible. Now, due to the unfortunate global situation that we're all in, why not take this time of isolation to broaden your horizon, expand your existing skills, or discover something completely new that you've always been interested in? With Skillshare, you could take advantage of the internet's largest learning community. They have classes in entrepreneurship, freelance, marketing if you wanted financial security and maximize your true earning potential. You can also explore Skillshare's expansive library in more creative endeavors. They have excellent tutorials on music production, fine arts, photography, graphic design, animation, and much more. Now, by using the link in the description, the first 500 people are going to get access to the entire Skillshare library with their premium service for 2 free months. If you like the service, you can actually sign up for their yearly plan for less than $10 a month. We want to thank Skillshare for making this content possible. Now, coming back to the whole laptop replacement idea for these tablets, the interesting thing is Apple will soon make available a smart keyboard attachment that will have a built-in trackpad, much like a normal laptop, and something that the smart type covers on the Surface Pro tablets have had all the way through their launch. So that's definitely good news. And with the new iPad OS that has support for mouse and cursor movements, you can actually use a mouse with the iPad Pro if you do desire. But with that trackpad, it's definitely going to be a lot more convenient and going to make it a lot more of a laptop replacement device. Sadly, at the moment, we're just using the standard smart keyboard attachment for the iPad Pro. We don't have access to the new one with the trackpad, but once that becomes available, we'll definitely test it out. But from a typing standpoint, the keyboard that we have over here is going to be essentially the same as the one with the trackpad and is very comfortable to use. Never had really any problems with Apple's type face covers. Now, in terms of the stylus performance, both the Surface Pro 7 and the Apple Pencil have very similar features. The iPad Pro, as you remember from the previous generation, had a new pencil design that was flat, allowing it to magnetically latch onto the tablet itself, making storage and access to the Apple Pencil a lot more convenient compared to the rounded previous generation Apple Pencil. And in terms of the tracking performance, both the Apple Pencil and the Surface Pen are pretty much on par with each other. Both platforms use a multifaceted system that utilizes different levels of pressure sensitivity. I do have to say, from a navigational standpoint, the Surface Pro pens are a little bit more precise since they have to deal with desktop-based applications that require more pinpoint accuracy, versus the Apple Pencil is great for applications that utilize more creative endeavors such as drawing, since it factors in rotational angles to emulate brush strokes or pencil strokes, and even the tip itself is texturized with a rubber finish, replicating the drag or resistance that you would feel when you're using a real pen and pencil. Now, moving on, let's talk about the internal specifications of these 3 tablets. Now, the A12Z Bionic is an 8-core integrated processor that also has 8 GPU cores. We have a new storage configuration starting from 128 gigabytes up to 1 terabyte of storage. All of these configurations come with 6 gigabytes of RAM. Now, the Surface Pro X has an integrated Qualcomm chip called the SQ1. It also has 8 CPU cores, and it's using the Adreno 685 GPU with 8 gigabytes or 16 gigabytes of RAM, depending upon your storage configuration, which range from 128 to 512 gigabytes. Now, the Surface Pro 7 gives you 10th generation Intel CPU options ranging from a Core i3, i5, and i7. The baseline i3 processor is a dual-core chip with 4 threads, and the i5, i7 are quad-core chips with 8 threads, with the exception that the i7 processor has faster core frequencies. The GPUs are also integrated on the Surface Pro 7 utilizing Intel UHD graphics, and the RAM and storage configurations are configurable from 4 gigs to 16 gigabytes of RAM and up to 1 terabyte of solid-state storage. Now, the only cross-compatible benchmarking platform that you can really utilize on iOS and Windows is Geekbench, and even with that said, there's still going to be different varying levels of hardware optimization on both platforms. But just to give you guys some sort of idea on how the multi-core and single-core performance fares up against the Microsoft Surface tablets, here we have the results laid out right in front of you. We're also including the A12X performance on the previous generation iPad Pro, which which isn't a whole lot different from the A12Z. As we mentioned before, they have a very similar CPU and GPU configurations, and from a multi-core and single-core performance, unsurprisingly, the A12Z processor on the iPad Pro is very fast. We're getting around 1100 points single core and about 4700 points on the multi-core performance, versus the SQ1 processor is getting around 700 points single core, 2800 multi-core, and the i5 version of the Surface Pro 7 is getting around 1100 points, which is on par with the A12Z and X processor from Apple, but the multi-core performance isn't as fast, only getting around 2300 points. Now, since we can actually do a direct comparison between the previous gen iPad versus the new generation iPad Pro, we're going to take a look at the Antutu benchmark specifically, which will factor in GPU and CPU performance, and we're getting a total overall score of over 719,000 points versus around 600,000 points on the previous generation A12X processor. And to give you guys a better idea in terms of the 3D performance using 3D Mark Slingshot, we're getting around 7,400 points on the A12X versus with the 8-core enabled on the A12Z processor, we're getting around 8,297 points. Now, moving on, let's talk specifically about the camera configurations on these tablets. Starting with the rear-facing cameras, the big addition on the 2020 iPad Pro is the fact that we have a 11mm ultra-wide camera. It's rated up to 10 megapixels. We can still shoot 4K video at 60 frames per second, in addition to the standard 12 megapixel camera, which was great to begin with for stills and video. And from a front-facing side, we have 7 megapixels on the front of the iPad Pro that can do 1080p video at 60 frames per second. On the Surface Pro tablets, the Surface Pro X has a 10 megapixel rear-facing camera. It can do 4K and 1080p video, and the Surface Pro 7 has the weakest camera, 8 megapixels with only 1080p video capturing capabilities, and the front-facing side is 5 megapixels with 1080p video at 30 frames per second on both Microsoft tablets. Now, in terms of camera quality and overall performance, it's really no contest. The iPad is hands down the winner in terms of delivering sharper and clearer images and videos with better overall color rendition, certainly better in terms of low light conditions for both the front side and the rear side as well. Now, the really cool thing about the iPad Pro, in addition to the better cameras, is we have a LiDAR system in place, which is a 3D depth sensing technology. It's actually using infrared lasers pulsing back and forth to enhance the augmented reality experiences that you're going to find in some applications, as well as the 3D depth sensing capabilities, which are going to be better for taking videos and photos and manipulating the focus and to have better overall metering and everything like that. So definitely interesting technology on the rear-facing side of the iPad Pro 2020 version. Now, lastly, let's talk about the overall battery performance of these tablets. Now, in terms of the capacity itself, the new generation iPad Pro is exactly the same configuration as the previous gen. So the 12.9-inch version of the iPad Pro has a 36.7 watt-hour battery. The Surface Pro X has a 40 watt-hour battery, and the Surface Pro 7 has a 45 watt-hour battery. All of these tablets are rated for at least 10 hours or more for general use. Now, we always like to do a video playback test just to get a simple baseline in terms of what the battery performance is like. Playing video in airplane mode with 50% brightness, we got a total runtime about 13 hours and 27 minutes on the new generation iPad Pro. The previous generation got around 12 hours 51 minutes, and the Surface Pro X got about 12 hours 4 minutes, and the Surface Pro 7 did the worst at around 8 hours and 19 minutes. Now, in summary, if we had to pick a laptop replacement device, my personal favorite is still the Surface Pro 7. It's the most versatile, and due to the fact that it's using Intel-based CPUs, you can run any Windows-based application without any limitation, unlike the Qualcomm chip that's in the Surface Pro X, which will not run applications that are not compatible with ARM-based processors. So stuff like some of the Adobe suite that I use on a day-to-day basis will not work. So that's definitely a bummer. Now, from a pure hardware perspective, I definitely think the new generation iPad Pro is definitely the most premium device, has the best overall display with the 120 Hz refresh rate, best overall form factor design, being thinner and lighter than the other tablets, superior internal processing capabilities, as well as better cameras and battery life. Now, from a pure laptop replacement. I don't think that it's as convenient or as expandable compared to the Surface Pro 7. And certainly with the trackpad keyboard attachment that's coming, it will become a more compelling laptop replacement device. And at the end of the day, if you have all the apps you need on the iPad platform, it's definitely a compelling option. Now we're going to do actually a comparison between the new generation iPad Pro and the new generation MacBook Air, which in a lot of ways is very similar in terms of price and performance capabilities. So definitely make sure you're subscribed to the channel for that. But other than that, that's really it for this video. Please give us a thumbs up. If you like this video, thank you so much for your support. Please visit the description down below for more details about everything we talked about. I also want to give a big thank you to Skillshare for making this video possible. Please check out the description down below if you want to try out Skillshare for 2 free months. And we'll see you later. Take care.